Welcome to Elysium Theatre Company's Durham Shakespeare Festival podcast 2023. Recorded with Durham University to mark the 400th anniversary of the publication of the First Folio, we present interviews with some of the leading Shakespearean actors and scholars in the UK. I'm Jake Murray, Artistic Director of Elysium Theatre Company, and with me are actor husband and wife Edward Fox and Joanna David. Thank you so much for doing this, Edward and Joanna. Can we begin just by asking, how did you first discover Shakespeare?
Well, I first discovered his writing, I must have been 14 or 15, but paradoxically, in a way, didn't understand him. The play under discussion or examination at school was Richard II, nor did I I just had no appreciation of the play. Age 14 or 15, this was at Harrow. It was taught by a man who wasn't really very inspiring, I suppose, but that's my first remembrance of becoming acquainted with Shakespeare. Paradoxically, I thought I wasn't interested in it. It's only later, really, and that's really the point I'm making, I think, is that he's such an intellect, Shakespeare. Every single line of him, it's pure genius. And until you are older and intellectually older and have lived a bit, I don't think he's the right man for you. The point in my mind for usefulness, perhaps, is not to worry when you're young that he may not click with you immediately. He's waiting to click with you later, but you have to persevere with him, just as in the same way Michael Elliott introduced Joanna and I. Avril knew him a bit more to T.S. Eliot and to four quartets on a Sunday evening. And again, just as my early Richard II encounter, age 14, 15, I simply didn't understand anything to do with four quartets at all and thought it not very interesting. I since, over the years, after many years, and many times of saying that poem in front of audiences, I've since come to know that it is a masterwork which the performer or the interpreter will never really know how masterful, but all you can do is commit to becoming more acquainted. As that's the same with Shakespeare. I think with Shakespeare, don't worry if you don't get him at first. You have to have lived somewhat to actually know what he is saying about living and life and character. You know, young actors can very often play Shakespeare, but I've seen it so often in lives, not to condemn them, it's just what is difficult is difficult.
What was it that changed your view of Shakespeare? How did you fall in love with him eventually?
I think it's to do with the music and the verse.
When did you first start performing him, Edward?
Thinking back now, unless you had work in a repertory theatre company, and there were many in operation when I was first starting and through the years subsequently, but unless you got work there in weekly or fortnightly rep was a really tough way to live. There wasn't any other sort of work. You couldn't get work in the West End unless you were very, very lucky or somewhat affiliated to the proclivities of the management reigning at the time, and there wasn't television. So there really was only one way to begin to be an actor and find out whether you should be an actor or not, and that was in repertory theatre. So I was very, very lucky indeed, because that doesn't exist now. The repertory system is eviscerated, if that's the word. I've said it so many times to Equity, how appalling for the future of the acting profession it is that repertory theatre has been eviscerated in the way it has, because the young will never learn from the mediums that now are thought to be the very thing, i.e. television.
Edward, may I say, you went to Hoxton with Terry Palmer.
That was the point I was going to make to Jacob. So what we did when one was younger, and I was 24 when I was lucky enough first had the chance to play Hamlet, we all banded together in an absolutely volatile, hotspot way and a group, and we just rehearsed that play for 6 months. consequently, we did get somewhere with it because we rehearsed it more or less every day in little rooms in Fulham, and it was a constant commitment. And I think that's the only thing that young actors who are not getting what you and I know is proper work, get together in a group and find your own way of putting on a play and just do it, rehearse it, pay your own bus fare, pay your own pub lunch, or somebody else will for you, but go ahead and find out how to get to grips with a great play. I'll tell you an amusing story if it's of any interest. We were rehearsing the scene when Laertes hears of Ophelia's death, and his line when the news is given is, "Oh, where? Your sister's drowned, Laertes. Oh, where?" And the actor playing the part was quarreling about his line. He said that the only thing I wouldn't say is, I might say, "Oh, God," or "hell," or whatever, but I wouldn't say, "Oh, where." It's being very, very tiresome, which is all part of that sort of group rehearsing. And through the door came one of the actresses, and she announced in a dramatic way, "President Kennedy's been assassinated." And we all said, "Oh, where?"
That's a wonderful story and a fantastic example.
It's a totally true story. And it's not because we were having this argument about Laertes' line. It was purely Shakespeare saying, "I know what human beings do in that situation."
Exactly. And I think that's a perfect example of the reality of Shakespeare, that it's not some idealized world, it's ordinary human experience. He understood our emotional reactions to things. Joanna, can I ask you how you first discovered Shakespeare and how you began performing him?
I had a remarkable education in classical ballet dancing. I had a scholarship to a ballet school. And the thing about the educational side, it came secondary to dancing. And unfortunately, in those days, I'm talking about 76, I can't work it out, but when I was 12, 13, we had an English teacher who would prop a book up in front of her and write letters. She was Canadian, and ask us to read Shakespeare out loud, giving every one of us a different part. And of course, we took advantage of that, not really bothering and certainly not learning anything. All I'm trying to say is when I left school, I had no education in Shakespeare. And eventually I went to drama school, and we had a wonderful woman who taught us about Shakespeare, who gave me an insight into Shakespeare. But I always felt, well, I don't really understand. And I was very young, 19, 20. But when I left drama school, I went to Liverpool, to the Liverpool Playhouse. And a bit like Edward was talking about, we had probably, I think, 2 weeks. It was 2 weekly rep, which was thought of as a luxury as opposed to 1 weekly rep. And I was asked to play Ophelia, and John Castle played Hamlet. And I suppose, with the help of the director, used a huge amount of my instincts as opposed to experience in Shakespeare. I was very aware. I didn't understand about really how to speak the verse. I didn't understand all the meter, and I felt inferior in myself about speaking Shakespeare, but the director gave one a huge amount of help. This was my first experience, and I wish I could go back and do it again with 50 years of experience I've found in life. But I suppose my thing I'd like to get across to anybody listening to this is that never feel, because you haven't been to university or had academic teaching about the way to speak Shakespeare, the way you have to do all the pentameter. And I entered into the heartbreaking situation that Shakespeare is remarkable about showing this innocent young girl who is driven in the end to losing her mind with the grief of her father being killed by the man she loves or loves. And think I was incredibly lucky to have the chance to play her. Of course, I wish I could go back and do it again better. But that was my start.
I think something that you've both highlighted there is that the best approach to Shakespeare is, well, instinctual, emotional. The way you've just described Ophelia, Joanna, very simple but very, very clear. When I do workshops with students, I often ask them to focus on the human relationships in the plays first, and then find the language after. Would you say that's a useful approach?
I think a very useful approach. I wish everybody had a chance to do a huge amount of Shakespeare. Make mistakes. Don't feel you've got to be perfect. Be able to go on that journey. And of course, in repertory, that's what we did, because I did Olivia in Twelfth Night at Ludlow Festival in the Castle. A wonderful director helped me through it. I again felt, oh God, do I know how to speak the language? But he made it so true, and the passions of love, that it was like Hamlet again. We probably only had 2 weeks or maybe 3 weeks by then as a luxury. But, if only one had had a chance to do more and more Shakespeare. That's my big regret, because every time you touch it and come to it, you learn, oh I cannot believe he said that. It's just how I felt at such and such a time. And I think that's what you meant, Edward, that as you come back to Shakespeare over and over again, it becomes crystal clear, and you think, how couldn't I have seen that before?
Well, the old actor's adage was, if you don't say the part in your sleep, you don't know it. And that is, at one's age now, I know it to be true. Unless it lives with you all the time, really, a part, you don't know it. Certainly with Shakespeare, for young people, I say just begin, and you will have a life's journey of pleasure and difficulty, but pleasure fundamentally, because every time you engage with him, you will learn something, not just about how perhaps to say it, so that for the listener, for the audience, they think that man or woman is saying that, and I believe him or her. I believe absolutely what they're saying. It's all actually intellectual. Unless you can get hold of the intellectual thoughts and understandings that Shakespeare writes, you don't even begin. If you're just saying him, means nothing.
Well, I don't mean I disagree with you, but nobody playing a Shakespeare part, if they only have 2 weeks or 3 weeks to deal with it, can have a complete intellectual understanding.
But that's part of the process of getting better.
Well, that's what I mean. You need to practice it. And I think in days gone past, and going back to Irving and Ellen Terry, who had these parts, be it Hamlet and Ophelia or Much Ado, and they had it in their brains and hearts and souls all during their careers. And they had an advantage over us because they lived with Shakespeare all the time.
Well, the great example is Irving, who made a great success in London with the Bells and then said to himself, I don't really know my job. Went out into the provinces and into Scotland, Edinburgh, I think, and in 1 year played 300 parts. He knew he needed to find out what his craft and the art of that craft was.
You're absolutely right, Edward. And in those days, Shakespeare was the mainstay. One of my favourite quotes about Shakespeare is in Long Day's Journey into Night, where Tyrone talks about when he was a young man, Tyrone being the father of the family, and loving playing Shakespeare. And there's a phrase he uses about, I would have done anything, I would have worked for nothing just to be alive in his poetry. And I think what you describe about an era when all great actors felt it was important to know their Shakespeare back to front and to play the great parts, that was very true, I think. Just going back a second, Edward, you said that Hamlet was this important role for you. Have you played Hamlet more than once?
Yes, I played it again at the Young Vic in a very unhappy and unfortunate production.
And it's your favourite part, would you say, of Shakespeare?
Well, as a young man, if you have any ambition as an actor, that's the part that all young actors feel for, isn't it?
What do you think it is about the part that is so attractive?
About Hamlet?
Yes.
Well, not only did he say everything, one needs to know. I don't know whether I can describe He just is a tremendously great play, and the more you involve yourself with it, the greater it seems to become.
Can I just say, I saw a production in a church in Guildford, and I'd never taken in before that when the players come to the court to entertain the king and queen, and Hamlet decides he's going to, because he knew the players that used to come and perform in the court, and it suddenly made me aware that, theatre was so important to their life. Then, it sort of brought me up short, that I hadn't sort of taken it in properly before. And that's a hugely important part of Hamlet, the reenactment of the murder and his decision to use them.
Well, he lights on it purely by his own the philosophy in his own soliloquy before. He says, calm down, stop getting in a fuss about my brain, which are the three most important words in life, I think, about my brain. And suddenly it hits him. I have heard the guilty creatures sitting at a play. And I think now that's what you have to take the audience on, what the man really is feeling. Gets in a stew. What the hell am I doing? Calm down about my brain. And the way he moves, the thoughts of the human being are like great music.
I think that's very correct. I think when I've never directed Hamlet, but those soliloquies, which he also does wonderfully in Othello and Macbeth and Lear, they are like music. They are like the human mind. He captures thought and talks about what goes on inside us. And I think sometimes we forget that he was really the first playwright to do that. Those soliloquies, and you're right, both of you, again, in those days where there was no television, no radio, no film, theatre was not just the entertainment, but what you're saying, Edward, the truth of theatre still has the power to touch people emotionally.
Absolutely. And Shakespeare continually saying that. The last things he says before abandoning the stage with Prospero, my object was to please. Boils it down to just that. But in that notion, his primary object was to please his audience. Please in the sense of sending his audience away, so I wouldn't have been anywhere else, known anything but this moment of 2 hours that I've just experienced.
And of course, we mustn't forget that Shakespeare was an actor as well as a writer.
Yes, and he knew how not to bore the audience. He knew to tell the story.
Again, telling the story. One of the first Shakespeare I directed was The Winter's Tale, which I did at university. And I was given 2 pieces of advice. One was by my father that Shakespeare was a genius and you have to lift yourself up to him rather than bring him down to you.
Absolutely right.
And the second was my mother, who said, even if all you do is tell the story, you will have a wonderful evening in the theatre. The stories in Shakespeare must come first, I think.
And you must tell the story with the maximum clarity, because if you don't, they will miss subsequent parts of the story. I mean, the beginning of Lear is a prime example. The beginning of Hamlet, too, is a prime example.
Absolutely. Did you ever play Hamlet and Ophelia together?
No.
Would you have liked to have done?
No. I think when you're domestically involved, we only did it in a family reunion.
So tell me, because the famous scene, Joanna, you talked about Ophelia being driven mad by the rejection she feels from Hamlet, the death of father by Hamlet, and that great scene between them, the get thee to a nunnery scene. How does one convince the audience that they love each other when he behaves so badly to her? When you played it, Edward, it's important that Hamlet loves Ophelia, isn't it?
Yes, I think one always tempted to play it dramatically and rhetorically. And I think that's completely the wrong way. I think by the time in the scene he says, I've heard of your paintings too well enough. God has given you one face. But I think it's much more powerful. Otherwise, you're stuck with dramatizing and effusive anger, which is quite unnecessary. Almost always to overuse. It's always overused, and particularly in Shakespeare. But I think in that scene, he doesn't really mean that. He's talking, again, intellectually about what women are and what men are. I've worked you out. You paint your nail, you paint your face. What's it all for? I think it's such a good scene, very difficult scene. But he has about 3 powerful speeches in it. Are you honest? Are you fair? And then says, it's very difficult for you as a woman to be fair and honest. But he works it out intellectually. It's quite difficult to get it over anyway. But if you overlay it with anger, are you honest? You stop an audience hearing actually what's in Hamlet's mind. He said, you're a woman. Now I'm going to talk to you about that. At the end of the scenes, as I say, I think he does, because she's giving him the false answers that she's been told to give him. It's the most wonderful scene.
And a tragic scene, because in a sense, he does love her. And because he's discovering deceit around him, he sees in her a deceit that she isn't doing. That's the tragedy.
He writes the letter to her, to Ophelia, and she reads it. And she has to show it to her father because she's been... Sorry, go on.
Yeah, well, I was only going to say, before it goes out of my mind, he also doesn't know that she's been set up.
Yes, true.
He may think, have you been set up? But he doesn't know.
Yes.
And actually, he's condemning her also for being unfairly, for possibly having been set up.
Or used, you mean?
No, Ophelia. He doesn't know, but I think if you're a clever production will make it clear that he does a little bit get to know through the scene that this is being listened to. Right at the end, he says, all but one shall live. All but one. My uncle is listening to this, I think. But how to make that into a story is a real craft.
Well, I think that issue of trust, it runs through all of Hamlet. The only person he feels he can trust is Horatio. Everybody else he doesn't trust, and it corrupts all his friendships, all his relationships, and that's where it becomes tragic. His loneliness, you know. Joanna, you were going to say something about Ophelia.
I can't put my mind back to where it was then, 50 years ago. But, you know, I believe that Ophelia went on believing Hamlet loved her, but everybody's input into what was wrong with him, you know, she was such an innocent, used by everybody.
She's very, very young and very innocent.
And, you know, when she got the letter from Hamlet and thought, I got to show my father, you know, wish to God she hadn't.
In a sense, she's crushed between all these different men, her father, Claudius, and Hamlet. And it's interesting how the play is structured, because the 4th act is her tragedy.
Yes, and she was brought up by her father. Her mother died very young.
Well, you don't really know about the mother. And also Laertes, that essentially she's a young woman in a man's world, and the one hope she has is the love she has for Hamlet, and that is destroyed.
The muddle of her grief when her brain has, you know, one all knows how incredible anxieties and pressures given. You don't sleep. You become crazed from insomnia. She had her own father killed by the man she loved. Imagine her brain, what a mess she was in.
Possibly a young maid's wits should be as mortal as an old man's life.
I mean, the more talking about the play now, this moment is so stimulating.
Well, I think, again, that's the thing, isn't it? As I say, Edward rightly talked about the intellectual aspect of Shakespeare. And there's also this very accessible emotional world where the relationships the characters actually have, they haven't gone out of date. They're still here and now, and has no one to help her, no one of her own sex to help her. And nor does Hamlet. Hamlet feels everyone is an enemy, and Ophelia has no ally, and it's a double tragedy in that respect, I think. It's Hamlet's tragedy and hers.
I haven't ever put my mind to that, and it's, of course, totally true. And also, something to say, you know, if you go and see a children's production in a school, and there's some extraordinary genius child in it who understands it, I think what we saw, I'm repeating myself, but the way they tell the story and make it so clear saying the words is another miracle of Shakespeare.
Well, it's the language is there to help you. It's not there to be an enemy. Edward, do you have any tips for actors dealing with Shakespeare's language? Any advice?
We've got to grow to love it. That's essential. And love it when it is poetry as poetry, not with a capital P, but poetry is the equivalent of classical music, say. I think you've got to love it. And you certainly got to, if you're going to express it professionally, certainly. But even as a pleasure to say it, you've got to find what the instrument of your voice coalesce with your mind, how to produce that so that it is poetry. Even the prose is poetry in a different way.
But you don't mean put on a poet voice.
I certainly don't mean that. That's what I'm not adequately expressing. I mean real. It's something beyond. You hear people speaking, as John has just illustrated, poetry as poetry. You can either feel it and do it and learn how to do it, or you...
Well, don't you feel that the basis of it as well is to have your own understanding of what you're saying?
Well, basically, it's that. It's how to express what is poetry. It's not something I can explain.
I think I know what you mean. I think your analogy of it being like classical music is a very good one. There is a richness to it and a heightened quality to it, which is more than the sum of its parts, you know, and it's stage poetry. So it's dialogue, but it has a heightened quality, I think.
That's right. You put it much better than me, Jacob, much better than me. That it is, in fact, just parley, but it has a heightened music. The analogy I would draw is you can hear people now play, say, a Beethoven sonata, and you think, my God, even the very young now, they're extraordinary technical ability. Fantastic, your ability to play this difficult, complicated music, but you're not actually telling me anything about the music. It's only the master who knows how to do all of that. Tell you also what Schubert or Beethoven was saying from here. That's a completely other story. And that's true of dramatic presentation for the actor. It's a very great art.
May I just say this, though, which is hugely important. Any human being from any background, any upbringing, can have whatever access to Shakespeare they choose, take it in by, whether it be introduced by the fantastic songs in some of the productions.
You don't have to be educated to be able to play Shakespeare. It's not about being educated at school at all. It's about your own education with living what your life is.
I think you've both spoken wonderfully about that. That analogy to do with Schubert was magnificent, Edward. And I think you're right, Joanna, because of course Shakespeare's actors weren't educated.
No.
They didn't drama school, and the audience wasn't educated, mostly. So it was the emotional connection and the language that did it.
Mm-hmm.
Keane, I don't think, was educated. I don't think Henry Brodribb Irving was educated.
It's for everybody in that respect.
Absolutely.
I think you've both spoken beautifully. If you wanted to say a last word, some message, something you'd like people to take away from this podcast, Edward, a gift for people to take with them when the podcast ends.
Well, certainly with Shakespeare, never give up. I gave up age 14, 15 with Richard II. I now spend every day, not every day, but most days, speaking his last soliloquy in prison because I love it so much. And that's nearly 70 to 80 years later.
Wonderful. Joanna?
I would say the more you read it, see it, hear it, the more you want to delve further.
And he's not going to make it easy for you.
And always have a complete works of Shakespeare in your room, your flat or your house, farm, so that always in the middle of the night or in the middle of a conversation, you can say, my God, I'm going to look that up.
I think I'd like to read the scene between Corin and Jaques in As You Like It. You'll get enormous pleasure. Your mind will be taken completely away from what you're feeling at the time, and you'll be involved with the countryman talking to the man who comes from the palace. Fascinating. But you can do that anywhere with any of the plays, really, as Joanna's just saying.
Wonderful. Well, listen, thank you very much to both of you. I really appreciate this. A wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And my goodness, everybody in the outskirts, inskirts of Durham, get to see your festival.
Absolutely. Good luck.
Thank you. That was Edward Fox and Joanna David sharing with us their experience of playing Shakespeare. To find out more about the Durham Shakespeare Festival 2023, go to our website, www.elysiumtc.co.uk.